Bad.
That's funny.
Did you drink coffee?
Only decaf.
All I drink is coffee. I drink like this carries 4 cups of coffee.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm like naturally high energy, so
I am not. I am naturally sleep 24/7. How is the sound, guys? Question mark. All right. Looks like everything's good. We got about 10 people watching, which is good for just posting it today and not doing a pre-stream, which I should have done. All right. Looks like we're good. Thanks for coming on. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
yeah. So thank you for having me. I'm really excited for this. My name is Joe Schmid, and I do both popular and scholarly level work in philosophy. So on the popular level, that's in terms of my YouTube channel called Majesty of Reason. Also, my blog, Majesty of Reason, and a book called The Majesty of Reason, A Short Guide to Critical Thinking in Philosophy. And in terms of scholarly work, I do work like writing papers, reviewing papers, things like that. I do those within the fields of philosophy of religion and metaphysics for the most part. So that's kind of an introduction to who I am. Oh, and I'm at Purdue right now, so that's where I am.
Awesome, awesome. I'm TJump. I do YouTube videos and sleep a lot. It's nice to meet you. I'm an atheist. I don't believe there are any reasons to believe in a God. I think that, or to put it more accurately, I had Greg Kokel told me about this. Many theists don't like it when atheists just say they don't have any reason to believe. So I've been trying to phrase it more often that I think naturalism is a better explanation for everything in reality than theism. So that is my position. Would you mind telling me a little bit about your position and tell you my thoughts on that and hear your thoughts on my position?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am an agnostic. So roughly, I break down agnostics into different categories, but I call myself an epistemic agnostic. So that just means that I think that, roughly after I've personally weighed the evidence on both sides, I think that the probability that God exists versus, for instance, naturalism, I think it's roughly counterbalanced between the two based on what I've researched and the evidence that I've come across. Now, just for people who want to get more into that and more into why I think that, they could check out one of my videos, Why Am I an Agnostic? It's called that, for people who want further in depth. But essentially, I am an agnostic. So I do think that there are certain pieces of evidence for naturalism that naturalism can explain better than theism. But contrary-wise, I also think that there are certain pieces of evidence that theism can explain better than naturalism. So that's really where I stand on the epistemological landscape. Um, uh, Now, as for what you were saying um, with respect to naturalism and theism or supernaturalism, I guess one area of inquiry that makes me lean towards theism, and then of course there are other areas like the problem of evil and things like that that lean me away from it. But one thing that I think supports theism is plausibly the existence of some kind of necessary concrete object that explains why there are contingent concrete objects. And so, although naturalism is compatible with this and the existence of a necessary concrete object that is the kind of ground of contingent reality, theism at least predicts that. Theism gives they give a prior account as to why we should expect that, whereas naturalism seems not to predict that. So that would at least be some piece of evidence for theism. And I can go into further detail, spelling out why we might be able to bridge a gap from necessary being to God, if you want. But I guess that's one reason, a kind of contingency-based style of reasoning on the basis of what Proust and Rasmussen do. But yeah, that's kind of the background of what I'd say in response to that.
Yeah, so that would definitely be an interesting place to start because I believe there is a necessary thing. I think that's perfectly reasonable to think there is some necessary foundation to reality.
Mhm.
But I don't see how that in any way indicates theism because every ideology pretty much starts with that. They all say something existed first, and then from that came what we know as the universe today. So it doesn't seem like that was predicted by theism because it's predicted by literally everyone. So why would you go from the contingency argument to a god specifically because this can be explained by just a natural something like the essence of just energy in the universe? It doesn't seem like this needs to be a conscious entity. Just to clarify, by god I usually define it as a some kind of a mind that created the universe, the first cause that is a mind of some kind. That's how I would define a god. And so if the first cause exists but has no mind, it wouldn't be a god by my definition. That seems far more plausible than any kind of a god hypothesis.
Yeah, no, see, that's where I've also kind of got hung up with. So with contingency arguments, there are, as you know, there are two stages really. Stage one tries to get to that kind of necessary foundation. So it looks maybe at contingent reality. It says, plausibly there has to be some kind of explanation for contingent reality, and we get to a necessary foundation of that. Stage two, however, tries to bridge that gap from necessary foundation to God. And actually, most of my reservations for the contingency argument are in that kind of second category. So while I do think that there are some arguments within that category that are suggestive, I don't think that there are any that are definitive. But I guess I'll articulate one kind of path that we might appreciate here. So, I guess we can ask, what is the nature of this necessary foundation? And a lot of people are quick, of course, to identify it with God, but it's good to slow down and see if it is actually God. As you pointed out, there might be certain naturalistic accounts like matter and energy or something like that. Well, one reason we might think that it couldn't be matter or energy is that it seems plausible to many philosophers and many people that anything that's kind of physical or material is going to be contingent. So, for instance, not only does our kind of abundant empirical experience support this, but also our best science actually seems to indicate that this is fundamentally true of material physical things. So, for instance, for every particle, there is an antiparticle, and when they collide with one another, they annihilate and give way to gamma radiation, for instance. And so we can smash particles together at the Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland, right? And we cause particles to undergo this kind of substantial change and give way to electromagnetic radiation. And because of that, such particles aren't necessary beings, and neither is the electromagnetic radiation. And so it does seem to be the case that we have reason to think that physical material things are contingent, in which case that could help us gain insight into the foundation of reality. If it's necessary, if it's a necessarily existent foundation, and if every contingent or every physical thing is such that it's contingent, well, then this thing's going to have to be non-physical, immaterial. So I'm wondering what you think about that kind of path.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's perfectly reasonable. The problem here is that when theists say, well, a mind, we have a reason to think a mind is not contingent, when in fact, every mind we know of is contingent. But it seems like we have actually more, even though everything we know of right now in the universe seems to be contingent other than energy because of the first law of thermodynamics and virtual particles, all examples of consciousness are definitely contingent, for sure. And so they make a jump from the fact that everything we know of is contingent for now, for the most part. But then we have some reason to conclude minds aren't for some reason. Like that part seems to be a stretch. And whatever reason theists cling to say that we can infer minds are not contingent, we can just use the same reason and apply it to things like energy or quantum particles or virtual particles or something about nature we haven't discovered yet. And that would be more plausible than concluding the mind is a non-contingent thing. So even though I grant that we don't have any scientific basis for necessary properties yet, there is nothing that would lead to, or going beyond the evidence like theists do, can be done on the naturalistic side with a greater reliability than the theists do. And so it doesn't seem like that argument leads to a theistic conclusion. It just says they go beyond the evidence where scientists usually don't, but scientists could totally do so to meet what the theist counts as evidence in this case.
Yeah, no, I really like how you're sort of pushing this line of reasoning to the edge. It's like, wait, hold on a second. Okay, maybe you might be able to get to some kind of non-physical immaterial thing, but how are you getting the mind out of this? And I love that. As an agnostic, I want to try to push that as well. I want to be like, well, hold on a second. You guys can't jump to this kind of conclusion so prematurely. So let's see if we could explore some other pathways that some philosophers have given for the mindedness of this being in question. So one of them is like, we've gotten to this necessary foundation, right? And it kind of explains this wonderful world of contingent things we find ourselves in. Now, what is its nature? Okay, so this, given that the world is a kind of like intelligible, orderly, regular, consistent, rationally investigatable, and contains massive amounts of stunning beauty, we might have reason to think that this kind of necessary foundation that accounts for this contingent world is more like a craftsman or an artist than some impersonal, chancy process, say. And we can put this inference in Bayesian terms. On the craftsman hypothesis, on the hypothesis that it's a minded foundation, right? The type of contingent world that we see is expected. It's got this kind of order, this regularity, this consistency, this intelligibility, and this mathematical expressibility and so on. Whereas under the negation of the craftsman hypothesis, under the hypothesis that the foundation is non-mental and so isn't intrinsically directed towards these very valuable ends, under the negation of the craftsman hypothesis, this kind of contingent reality that we see is unexpected or less expected than on the craftsman hypothesis, that we would see such order and regularity and intelligibility. And so given that we do see such order and so on, that would provide some evidence in Bayesian terms for the craftsman hypothesis. I'm wondering what you think about that line.
Yeah, to me that seems like a composition division fallacy, where, like you say, or at least I think that's right, where all roses are flowers, but not all flowers are roses. So to explain that more, what I mean is, if we have a craftsman who is going to design an orderly universe, then obviously we would expect an orderly universe. But there could be infinitely many different kinds of craftsmen who, like postmodern artists, want to make a crazy universe who it makes no sense at all. And so if we take the accumulation of all possible designers, the probability that we would get a universe that is orderly like we see it is the exact same as if we have a non-designer and we take the entire spectrum of possible different combinations of laws, because they could have some variation of those would make an orderly universe, and some variation would make a crazy universe like a postmodern artist, just like the variation of designers. So the fact that that a particular kind of designer would be indicative of the orderly universe, a particular kind of set of laws would also be indicative of a particular kind of a universe that we see. So it only follows that the designer is more likely if you're only selectively choosing the designers that would make an orderly universe. But you can also do the other way around and say, well, if we're just looking at the selectively kinds of laws that would make an orderly universe, that would be more likely than if we took the accumulation of all possible designers. So it seems like the probabilities aren't actually different there. It's just selectively comparing certain kinds of designers to this entire spectrum of laws, which we can just, again, flip that on the atheist side and compare certain kinds of laws to the entire spectrum of designers to get the same disparity in probability towards the atheistic side.
Yeah, no, it's funny that you mentioned like the postmodern art thing. I'm actually in a philosophy of art class right now, and asking what is art. We're doing conceptual analysis, the if and only if kind of like something is an artwork if and only if something. And we just talked about like Kandinsky or something, and it's just like he has a work called The Cow or something, and it took me like 10 minutes to find the cow, and it was horrible. And then there's this other one. It's called like Saint Gregory or something, and I have no clue what it is. Like, I don't even know. I'm at a loss for words. So like, apparently this is like art, but anyway. So I liked your point there that we do have to kind of add more specifications to the hypothesis. So I think that, though, that once we do add those specifications to the hypothesis, we can kind of increase the probability of the data, increase the expectability of the data on the hypothesis than on, for instance, a non-minded foundation. So if we have the foundation theory that, we could take theism, for instance. Theism would predict this because God is perfect, say, and God desires these kind of valuable, intrinsically orderly things. God is a rational being and so on. And so he would presumably have certain desires for the type of contingent reality that we see that has this kind of order, regularity, intelligibility, and so on. On the contrary, though, if we have the hypothesis of a non-minded foundation, it seems as though it doesn't provide that probability-raising resources. It doesn't provide that kind of the resources by which we can increase our expectability of that data on the hypothesis, right? So theism gives that by way of the desires that God has and God's perfect nature. Whereas the non-mental foundation theory, it just seems it would be indifferent, right? It would be indifferent to the beauty of reality, to the order of reality, to those things. And so if that's the case, if one of them provides greater expectation of the evidence and the other one does not, it's indifferent to it, then we have at least some, and given that we observe that evidence, we have, per Bayes' theorem, we have some evidence for the theistic hypothesis in this regard. So I'm wondering what you think about that.
Well, yeah, I would say that the exact same thing applies in the previous case. So, for example, if you compare a broad spectrum naturalism, like what you called a non-minded foundation, that isn't a property, that's the lack of a property. So it's just no specific description of what this is. It's just saying there's just a collection of things. Whereas if you take a God who has a specific desire to create an orderly universe, that's a very specific kind of a God. So if you take the broad spectrum of all possible gods, including those that do not have this particular desire, and compare it to the spectrum of all possible non-minded foundations, they're going to be the same. There's going to be infinitely many gods who would make a orderly universe, and infinitely many would make a random universe, and infinitely many combinations of laws that would make an orderly universe, and infinitely many that would make a non-orderly universe. But because you're adding a specification to it, you're saying there is a God who has this particular desire to make a universe. That means that I get to do the same thing on the alternative hypothesis. So I get to say there is this particular combination of laws that is essentially more orderly because it's related to some kind of quantum particle that determines these laws or whatever. Then that particular kind of a universe would have the same probability as the God who has the particular property of being orderly. So if you compare the spectrum of both, all possible gods, those that have a priori reason to create an orderly universe and those that do not, to all of the natural laws that have an a priori reason to create a universe like this and those that do not, you get the same probability. And you also get the same probability if you compare those specific kinds of gods that have a reason to make orderliness and the specific kinds of universes that have a reason or determination to make orderliness. So it seems like the probabilities are, again, the exact same, but the conflation is when the theist is taking a specific kind of a god who has a particular property who would therefore do this, and not then comparing it to a specific kind of a universe who has a particular property that would also do this. They're comparing it to the larger set. So, but again, I can just do the same thing and compare a specific kind of a universe that is predetermined to make the laws these ways because of the quantum relationship, and compare that to the larger set of gods, those that would design orderliness and those that would not. And it will seem like the probability is more on the naturalist side. But again, that's because I'm conflating the particular example that we have a predisposition to do one thing to the entire set of other things, which average out to be a null hypothesis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I am trying to, let me try to see if I could push further, because again, I'm trying to steelman the theist position. As I said from the beginning, I'm an agnostic, but I'm trying to steelman it.
Dirty theist, closet theist.
Let's see if we can push our hypotheses as far as we can. So I'm going to try to steelman the theist in response to what you just said. So here's what the theist would probably say. There is actually a relevant difference between the case of the hypothesis of theism and raising our expectation of the data of orderliness and so on. There's actually a relevant difference between that and the maneuver or method that you just specified of, maybe there's this kind of quantum property that has that intrinsic specification that raises the probability of the data. So maybe there's a relevant difference there. What is that relevant difference? Well, the theist might say, well, hold on a second. Like, we're not just saying God exists and there's also this particular desire that raises the probability. No, rather, they can just take the hypothesis and they can say, well, actually, we can just derive it from our specification of the hypothesis itself. And it's a logical entailment of the hypothesis, not an auxiliary hypothesis that we add to the hypothesis, right? So if we just have the hypothesis that there's a perfect being, say, well, then now we can ask, well, what could we derive from a perfect being? Well, what are its logical entailments? Well, presumably one of them would be mindedness, because minds are plausibly more valuable than non-minds. And so if this thing is maximally valuable and it has all the great making essential properties, then it's going to be minded. And also it's going to have further desires that are greatness conferring desires, like perfect being theology. That's really what I'm getting at. So you can probably, presumably, so the theist is going to argue, you might be able to derive these desires or these reasons as a logical entailment of perfection, because a being which has those desires is more perfect than a being which lacks them, which doesn't care about these rational and orderly intelligible universes. So you can kind of derive it from the hypothesis in question instead of adding it as an auxiliary hypothesis. And that's on the theism side. But on the naturalism side, you can't really, it seems, so the theist would argue, that you can't really derive it from a kind of core simpler hypothesis. You have to add it as an auxiliary hypothesis, and that lowers its probability, because you have to add that there's this weird quantum property, say, that is intrinsically directed towards it. You don't get that as a kind of logical entailment of the naturalistic hypothesis. You have to add it. Whereas with the theism, you can get that as a kind of entailment because it just follows out of the concept of a perfect being. So I'm wondering what you think about that kind of response.
Well, yeah, I would come back and simply mirror the same argument. I'd say that from my perspective, these perfections that you describe in a god seem to be totally ad hoc. Like, you say a god would have these perfections. Well, I could just say a god would have a different perfection, like the perfection of the essence of spaghetti. And so it's going to be the flying spaghetti monster is the only possible god. Because it seems like what you're doing is you're saying that, well, there's not really a big spectrum of gods. Like, the only logically possible spectrum of gods has to be those that have these set of properties. Therefore, the probability, if you compare the entire set, isn't actually different, because there's not a big set that would not create a specifically ordered universe. The problem is that when you add these properties in and say God would have these perfections, that seems totally ad hoc. There doesn't seem to be any reason to conclude that your list of perfections is more likely to be correct than any other arbitrary list of perfections I could make up, like spaghetti. And I could just do the same thing and say, well, I'm going to derive, because of my hypothesis that the law, or that physics is going to entail this quantum particle of the Bob particle, and only the Bob particle is the only possible kind of quantum particle, and it has these specific kinds of properties related to perfections of particles, and it's only possible for particles to have these kinds of perfect properties that would lead to a orderly universe. Therefore, there isn't really a big spectrum of different possible universes that would result in a non-orderly universe. It's only going to create an orderly universe. That's the only kind of quantum particle that can exist, because it has these perfections that are entailed in the definition of the quantum particleness. And so it seems like adding in these perfections to define your hypothesis as the only reasonable hypothesis, or the only reasonable spectrum of hypotheses, seems to be arbitrary, and anybody can do that. As you do for theism, I can just mirror it onto the atheistic hypothesis, again, to balance out the probabilities either way.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So I'm wondering though, like, it seems as though we do have a kind of independent, non-arbitrary, principled access to what things are perfections and what things are not. So for instance, okay, so what do we mean by perfection? We mean a great making property, really, something that confers greatness or value to the being, to something qua being, to its being a being as a being. So, and what is a great making property? Well, it's something that, all else being equal, it is better for a being to have than not have. And so once we get this account in question, and once we get clear on what a great making property and a perfection is, I actually think that we probably have non-arbitrary means of deducing what are great making properties for beings as such. So for instance, I think that a being is better to the extent that it has an intellect versus not having an intellect. I think that I think we can just see that there's value, there's a kind of greatness to that. And so we can get that an intellect is a perfection of being a being, say. We can also probably get goodness, say. All else being equal, a being that is good is better or more valuable than a being that is not good. Same with knowledge, say, and so on. And so I think that we have these non-arbitrary access. Like, I think we can just see that some of these things are good. Like, if I told you that, I know Josh Rasmussen gives this example, like he's giving the praises of his wife, and he's saying, like, you're so like beautiful, you're so kind, you're so loving, you're so knowledgeable, you're so horrible. And then, and that last one, you know, we can just see that doesn't belong in them, because being horrible is not like a great making feature. Whoops, I knocked out my earplugs. Whoops. So yeah, I think that there are these non-arbitrary ways that we can deduce perfections. And take the spaghetti example, right? Like, intuitively, the property of being spaghetti, or having an essential spaghetti properties, that doesn't seem to make a being better than if they lacked it. Like, why spaghetti as opposed to penne pasta? Or like, why, you know, like, intuitively, these don't confer value to a being qua being. Whereas goodness and intellect and things like that do seem to confer such value. So I'm wondering what you think about that kind of symmetry breaker there.
Yeah, so the first issue is value in and of itself seems to be an arbitrary criterion. Until we can determine that value is a thing that actually exists independent of our imagination, then we can't use it as an indication of some kind of ontological property in some being. Because right now it's just like saying, well, I imagine there is Klingonness, and the Klingonness is a real property, it's a perfection, and, well, the perfect being has to have this perfection of Klingonness, because clearly Star Trek is the greatest show ever, therefore must be a Klingon. So until we can actually verify that this hypothesis that we have of this property of value itself corresponds to something in reality, we cannot confer it to being a property that is required of the ultimate being. And the same thing applies to each of the individual perfections. Even if we grant that value is in and of itself a real thing in the universe, there is objective value, and this value is intrinsic to whatever the fundamental nature of reality is. That doesn't tell us anything about the particular things that make value. Our intuitions tell us nothing. Again, intuitions are a great way to give us a hypothesis, but they don't confirm the hypothesis. So I can come up with the idea, I think beauty is valuable, I think intelligence is valuable, but until you can independently confirm that your idea corresponds to reality, then it's just an idea. It doesn't count as evidence to lean one way or the other, any more than my idea that Klingonness is the greatest thing because Star Trek is the greatest show ever. So the two things there would be, one, you first need to demonstrate that value is an objective thing independent of our imagination and does actually exist in this ultimate necessary being, which I don't think anyone has shown yet, which means if this isn't the property, then there's no reason to just conclude these ideas of perfections are just completely arbitrary and ad hoc to begin with, and you can just say it's a quantum particle made of physical stuff and you don't need any of these perfections. Secondly, even if we grant perfections are real, then you would need to do the same thing for each of the particular perfections you are associating with, to say that this is actually a real perfection and not just something I intuitively feel. And those would be my two responses to say that, well, we can still do the same thing on naturalism and come up with different perfections or different ideas of value to indicate the quantum particle is, again, equally as probable as the theistic hypothesis.
Yeah, so with respect to your first query, let's see. How should I go about this? Because now we're getting into I like it. We're getting into like the fundamentals of philosophy, like objective value and things like that, objective goodness and axiology and so on. So I guess I'll ask you, do you think that, there are kind of objective value or good making properties, or at least goodness, like objective goodness?
I'm a moral realist, so in that sense, I think morality is objective.
Okay, so that's good. So then it seems as though we are in agreement with respect to this first query, that there is at least objective value or goodness in reality. That, for instance, even if none of us imagined some person to be valuable, they would still be intrinsically valuable in and of themselves, and they would still possess that kind of moral worth or value or goodness or what have you. And even if like the Nazis had won the World War II and we all had become brainwashed, like Jews would still be valuable and so on. So I'm good that we can agree with respect to that. So it seems as though we're both on board with this kind of.
Well, I totally agree with you, but still, you would still need to show that. Just being able to assert it in the fact that we agree would not be sufficient evidence to justify your conclusion. So you still need to show that some kind of objective morality or objective value does exist. And I think no one's been able to do that yet. Lots of ethicists have theories, including myself, but it hasn't been demonstrated this exists independent of the mind yet. So you can't actually use it as evidence towards a conclusion about what exists. You can only use it as a hypothesis maker. So I have a hypothesis based off of this thing that I think exists, but until it's confirmed, you can't use it as evidence yet.
So, yeah, so I agree that definitely we're going to have to, if we're going to have to establish, presumably, moral realism in order for this argument to get up and running. So I definitely agree with you there, that we can't just assume it and say oh, hey, we've got this assumption on board, let's go on our merry way. So I totally agree with you that we need some independent reasons for being moral realists. But I just wanted to make a dialectical point in asking you, so long as we're both on board with this first query, we can go on and investigate together the second query. So that was really what I was going to say. So we could probably set aside those kind of independent reasons that meta-ethicists and ethicists give for thinking that moral realism is true. So,
well, the reason I brought that up, because I totally understood where you were going with that, but I do want to make the point that there isn't objective morality isn't a solved problem in physics. It's not agreed that there is an objective morality. So there isn't any demonstrable proof of moral realism yet. It's just a hypothesis in ethics. Until you can actually move it from the hypothesis stage to the confirmed consensus stage, you can't use that as evidence. It's just a hypothesis, like saying we imagine that multiverse is the most preferred theory in physics right now by a small margin. You can't use the multiverse as evidence of a different hypothesis yet, because it's just a hypothesis. Until it's been confirmed, you can't use that as confirmatory evidence of your next hypothesis. You have to start with the multiverse thing. So the same thing applies to any arguments using moral realism as a basis to lead to another argument. Because it's just a hypothesis like the multiverse, until it's been confirmed, you can't use that as evidence. Just like I can't use the multiverse as evidence of my quantum particle.
So what do you mean by confirmed?
You need some methodology to differentiate imagination from reality. That would be confirmation.
Okay, so we just need some kind of independent reason for it. Is that what you're saying?
Well, just any methodology that can accurately differentiate imagination from reality. So that would be the same thing as a reason. It's just definitionally the same, but it wouldn't just be an argument you could present. You'd have to actually present something sufficient that would qualify as a successful methodology that can accurately differentiate imagination from reality. So whatever methodology you're going to propose, we're going to have to test this methodology against other things in the world and say, well, does this work to differentiate against imagination and reality in these cases? If no, then it's not reliable in this case either. So you'd have to present some methodology that can independently differentiate imagination from reality in lots of other cases. And then if it can do that, we can infer that it could in this case too. So what you need is to present a methodology that can differentiate imagination from reality that then says this value thing is one of the non-imaginary, the reality things.
So, by what methodology did you come to that conclusion?
That most of the stuff we imagine is imaginary and not real. Like I can imagine a unicorn, but it's not real. And I can imagine a cup, and the cup is real. So there's two different classes of things. There's things I imagine that do correspond to reality and things I imagine that do not correspond to reality. And we need some method to differentiate between the two in order to have the justification that it is actually one of the reality things and not just one of the imaginary things.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. But I think where you can see I'm getting hung up with is probably I just conceive of this kind of methodology as more so reasons giving, like we give reasons for believing the thing in question.
Oh, just to clarify, so I haven't said anything about the methodology. Just you need to present a methodology. You can present whatever methodology you want.
Yeah. Well, I conceive of this methodology that you're talking about as a process of giving reasons for the hypothesis in question. And so if we're understanding the methodology like that, then I do think that there are going to be confirmation in your sense as providing this methodology. There is going to be confirmation from moral realism, say, in terms of giving reasons for thinking that moral realism is true. So,
well, again, because reason here would be synonymous in my terminology as being a thing that can differentiate imagination from reality. Like if you want a reason to believe something is real and not imaginary, then you need some method to differentiate, is it imaginary or is it real? That would be a reason. But if it can't do that, then it's not a reason. So in order to qualify as a reason, it has to be able to differentiate imagination from reality.
Yeah, it has to count in favor of its being true or being real, mind independently, and so on. So
Sure.
I think we're largely in agreement here. I think it's just a difference in terminology that we're using.
Well, I think you'd have to give an example of what you think is a reason first, and then I can try to show you how what I'm going to do to it is try and show it can't differentiate imagination from reality, so it doesn't count as a reason.
Okay. So what if I told you that, here's one reason that I think moral realism is true. I think that it just seems obvious to me that Jews have value regardless of what Nazis or what other people will say. So it just seems obvious. What do you think about that kind of reason?
It seems obvious to me that this cup is solid, but we know that's false because it's 99% empty space. The fact that it seems obvious to you is just your imagination. And all it does is it brings it forward as is this one of the imaginary or one of the real things? That's all it does. It doesn't give you a way to differentiate between the two. It just provides you with evidence it's one of those two.
Yeah, so, well, then how do you differentiate between, because like philosophers and epistemologists have realized that it's very hard to avoid radical skepticism. So in order to avoid that, we either have to take like an externalist route where we say that factors external to the knowing subject confer justification to his or her beliefs, or we take a kind of presumably like a phenomenal conservativist route where we say, listen, something seeming to be the case, something seeming to be obvious, provides evidence for its being the case, provided that there aren't sufficient defeaters or overriding reasons to doubt that the deliverances of our seemings. So I'm wondering how you avoid the kind of radical skeptical objections.
I take the second approach. I take the second approach you mentioned. So we have rational defeaters for any basic belief who say most of our beliefs were always wrong. We pretty much throughout all human history, every one of our beliefs was completely wrong. And the way we figured it out was we imagine the way things are. Lots of people imagine like what knocked over that cup. Maybe it was a bird, maybe it was a squirrel, maybe it was the flying juju under the sea, or a lightning bolt, or an invisible alien. There's infinitely many things that could explain what knocked over that cup. And everybody in the tribe thinks it's a different thing. But the one who gets it right can say, if I'm right, I can predict something we don't know yet, and we can discover it, because my mind doesn't control reality. Like I can't lift the TV up with my thoughts.
Wait, so, that's not normal? No, I'm kidding.
What? I know, right? Like, damn it. But so the fact that I can't control reality means that if I can predict something by reality, I just mean the thing we're experiencing, not literally an ontological claim here. So there's a difference between the things I can control in my sense experience, things I cannot control in my sense experience. Like the TV is one I cannot control. The pink unicorn is one I can control. And so of those things, if I can make a prediction about the things I cannot control and get it right, that is good evidence that my hypothesis corresponds to this not control area that I'm going to call reality, as opposed to just being one of the imaginary things. So I can take this methodology of like what you meant. We have a belief based on evidence that doesn't have a defeater, and then which is novel testable predictions. And if that's confirmed, that's good evidence. Now, just having the belief on its own would be itself defeated because we know that everything we believed for pretty much all human history was wrong. So every just belief we have that is basic is just defeated immediately because we have demonstrated human beliefs are wrong so consistently about everything.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess I should clarify my question that I was not sufficiently clear. So my bad there. I was wondering how you in particular avoid the kind of brain in a vat Cartesian demon scenarios, right? Like because the criterion that you're providing, it almost seems to me that it's not going to be. It almost seems like the criterion you're providing is going to land you in this kind of radical skepticism, because it seems to me that there's going to be no way that you can differentiate between something's being really real, really true, really objective out there versus everything just being simulated by the Cartesian demon that is just feeding you your intuitions, your sensations, every single thing about it. So how does your methodology avoid that?
Well, it doesn't require certainty, so I obviously don't need 100% certainty I'm not a brain in the vat. But if I can get something that indicates more one way than the other with some probability, that would be good reason to conclude I'm not a brain in the vat. So the fact that I can make predictions about reality, I can't control reality, that's good reason that indicates I'm not a brain in the vat. Like I forget the exact example they used in fallibilism is I have hands, I can't have hands if I'm in the matrix, therefore I'm not in the matrix. Just something that basic would lend some very minuscule probability one way rather than the other, which then, based on fallibilism, means I can conclude if I meet some threshold of percentage probability that I'm not a brain in the vat, even though I can't get to the 100% mark.
Yeah, but like when you say that you have hands, how do you differentiate that from your imagining hands and from its being really real? I'm just trying to go back to your methodology, right? The being able to differentiate between imagination and reality. So that's kind of the criterion that we're working with. So how do you differentiate between that premise of, well, I have hands, if you're just imagining it, or if the Cartesian demon is simulating that, how do you differentiate that from your really, really having hands?
Well, again, it's the novel testable predictions. If I can make novel testable predictions, that methodology gives us credence towards whatever conclusion we make. It doesn't matter. So
sorry to interrupt. I just want to say, like, how do you know that your predictions are really coming out true? I mean, it could just be the Cartesian demon that is simulating you having those predictions and is simulating that those predictions come out true.
That'll be fine. Even if that's the case, they're still confirmed. That counts as evidence. So even if that was the case, that's still evidence.
Well, no, because you can't differentiate this imagined scenario where you're merely imagining the confirmations versus it's really being real that there are these confirmations.
Well, the reality is just the sense experience outside of the mind stuff we can control. That's what we mean by real. So it's just the sense experience confirmation there. So if I make a prediction that I'm going to find squirrel droppings around the cup and I do it, that's confirmation it was done by a squirrel. Could it have been an evil leprechaun that placed the droppings there? Yep, completely possible. But that isn't supported by the evidence because it wasn't predicted, it was post-dicted. So if I made a hypothesis that there's an evil demon deluding me and he's going to place squirrel droppings there, and so if we look at the cup and we find squirrel droppings, that would be evidence of an evil demon. But because we don't do that and we make predictions that it's a squirrel and therefore we're going to find squirrel droppings, that is evidence of the squirrel. Also, it's simpler, but I don't really care about simplicity. All I care about is testable predictions. So any testable predictions you make, that in my epistemology differentiates imagination from reality for whatever hypothesis. So if I predict I am not in the matrix and I predict the sun will come up tomorrow, supposing we didn't know how the sun worked, and I got it right, that would be evidence we're not in the matrix in my epistemology.
Okay, so, but with respect to the testable predictions, right, how are you differentiating one scenario, let's call it scenario A, from scenario B? So scenario A is you make a testable prediction that it is a squirrel that's leaving the droppings, and then you go out and you find the squirrel, or you find the droppings, and then you look at the squirrel and you see something that allows you to tell that that's the squirrel that left the droppings. Scenario B is the prediction that reality is being simulated in my mind by a Cartesian demon such that I perceive in my mind and I hallucinate that there are these droppings, and I hallucinate a squirrel, and so it's identical to the other one. It's just a hallucination, right?
Yep.
How do you differentiate between those two? Because they both have the testable.
Well, no, that's the case. They don't. Whichever one I can use to make testable predictions is the one that's true. So it doesn't make it, like, even though I could hypothesize the evil demon first, I didn't. I hypothesized the squirrel first. Squirrel worked. Evidence of the squirrel, not the evil demon. Whichever one I hypothesize first that gets the answers right, that one is differentiated from all of the others as being more true, more likely to be true.
Both of them are entirely consistent with your
consistency doesn't matter. So the only thing that matters is what's first. Whichever one I come up with first.
Temporally first matter to the evidential confirmation of the thesis.
Because it's much harder to get things right before we know it than it is after we know it. So the problem of underdetermination is everything we know. We can make up infinitely many ways to explain it. Like everything. What?
If I had come up first, for some reason,
What?
with the hallucination hypothesis that I'm hallucinating
Yeah.
by means of a Cartesian demon, if I'm hallucinating that the squirrel droppings are there and and then that comes true, then I'm justified in that.
Yes, that would be evidence towards your conclusion. Absolutely, 100%, and that's really easy to prove. Check out this example. So if the Old Testament said that that I, your God, created the world 6,000 years ago, and I made the cosmic microwave background, and I made DNA as a double helix, and I put these fossils in these places to make it look like it was there, every single human being on the planet would be a young Earth creationist.
Well, yeah, that's a prediction versus postdiction. We're talking about temporally just coming. Which
no. That's the thing. The only reason we believe it is because it came first. It came up with these predictions before we knew them. That's what makes it believable. If it like someone wrote the Bible today and added these in, no one would believe it because it would be a postdiction.
Yeah,
the thing that makes my example is the exact same thing. If I predict it's an evil demon placing the squirrel droppings there, that would be like the Bible predicting the cosmic microwave background instead of being a postdiction, like saying it was explained after we already knew it. So the same thing applies in my example of the squirrel and the evil demon versus God in the Old Testament writing this before or after we already knew these things. It's about what came first. That's the pre part and the prediction, which is what makes it evidence.
Yeah, no, I agree that prediction is probably much more evidentially conferring than postdiction as that's an interesting question in the philosophy of science, but we can set that aside. But when we're talking about the scenario A versus scenario B, right? Both of these are predictive scenarios.
Well, no, that's the case. They're not predictive.
Well, let me articulate it. So in this one, before we look at the data of the droppings in the squirrel, right? We make a prediction that there is a mind-independent squirrel, and a mind-independent squirrel dropped the droppings, and so on. So we make that prediction before looking at it. So that's scenario A. In scenario B, before going out in our hallucinatory world, before going out and looking at the hallucinatory droppings and the hallucinatory squirrel, right? We make the hallucinatory hypothesis before going out there that, I'm going to hallucinate the droppings and I'm going to hallucinate the squirrel out there. And then we go out there and we see the squirrel, we see the droppings, and so on, right? And so in both of these cases, it's prediction. But in one of them, we are completely hallucinating reality, and the other one is reality. So I'm wondering how you because your methodology was.
Yeah, that's perfectly fine. You wouldn't be able to differentiate. They'd both have evidence. Both of those conclusions would be justified by the evidence, but luckily that almost never, ever, ever happens.
See, the question is, how do you know that never, ever, ever happens, right? Because we're using a criteria of knowledge.
Because we never come up with two hypotheses at the same time that can make the same predictions almost ever. It's very, very rare. So there's always one first.
I could do it right now, right? So one of my predictions right now is scenario A. So when I drop this pencil, it'll fall, and it's a mind-independent pencil, and it's going to fall. But another prediction is I'm having a sense experience as of a pencil. It's being caused by, it's a hallucination, and my sense experience that's being hallucinated as of the pencil, I'm going to hallucinate the pencil falling upon me dropping it. Okay,
right.
So we do it, and look, it dropped. So now we have.
So that doesn't count because it's not a novel prediction. Like you have to predict something we don't already know yet. Like if I predict the sun's going to come up tomorrow, therefore the spaghetti monster is real, like obviously no one's going to believe that. Or if I predict the numbers of last week's lottery numbers, like obviously that's not going to be evidence of whatever I'm saying. It has to be a prediction of something we don't know yet. So if you can predict something we don't know yet, then it would be evidence. So for example, if you came up with a hypothesis that the magical genie exists, therefore we're going to discover dark matter is made of magical pink puppies, and you make another hypothesis that we're not in a delusionary hypothesis and there's magical pink puppies that are actually causing dark matter, and we discover that dark matter is caused by magical pink puppies, then both of those hypotheses would be equally supported until we made new novel predictions to differentiate between the two.
So I actually disagree with that particular portion because there are some pieces of data that we actually do know, and we come to have evidence for our hypothesis on the basis of it's being able to predict or explain the thing that we already knew, but which other hypotheses weren't able to explain it. So for instance, that happens all the time in science. We have, for instance, the retrograde motion of the planets, for instance. The Ptolemaic system was not able to account for that, or it had to use these really ad hoc postulations to account for that. And so we knew that this data was there all along. But then we came up with, like Newtonian, gravitational theory and so on, and that was actually able to accommodate that past data that we had already known. It's not a novel prediction. We had already known that. and it's able to accommodate that better than all of its rivals, and thereby it gains evidential justification per every single philosopher of science would say that it gains evidential justification on the basis of that, even though it's not a prediction.
No, not really. So that's actually wrong. It gains some very minimal kind of useless kind, but the reason it's really accepted is the novel testable predictions. That's why it's accepted, is that once we take this model and apply it, we get new, more accurate data. That's better, not the fact that it just explains
everything. That was not your claim. Your claim originally was that it does not confer evidence towards it.
Yeah, for my epistemology, I don't even care about it. I'll discount that immediately. I don't care at all. It counts as nothing for me. It only counts as evidence if it's a novel testable prediction in my epistemology.
But now that's just a reductio, right? Like everyone agrees that Newtonian theories predicting, not predicting, but being able to account for that retrograde motion of the planets that none of the other ones in the past were able to account for. Everyone agrees that that's evidence for it. That's some reason to think that is true, that it accounts for those better than all of its rivals, and that it's able to go back and be able to predict something that we already knew.
Well, no, again, the reason it was accepted was not that. That was not.
Think about
I understand what you're saying, but that's not the reason it's ever accepted in science. No one cares about that.
We're not talking about acceptance. We're talking about evidential confirmation. It provides some evidence for it, which is what you just denied.
Right. So in mine, is this what qualifies as acceptance verification is just the testable predictions, never the fact that it can post-dict anything. I don't care about that at all. So mine will never accept that as evidence. And no one in the consensus will either. The consensus of experts only accept it with the novel testable predictions, never the post-diction. Like every model in quantum mechanics can post-dict all of the experimental data in quantum mechanics. No one accepts them. No one cares. None of them are accepted because they don't make novel testable predictions. The criterion in science of acceptance and what qualifies as real evidence is, can it make novel testable predictions? And if it can't, it's nothing. That is the standard in science, and that is my standard too. The fact that some philosophers will count it as evidence, their standard of evidence is far lower than that of real scientific data, whereas mine isn't. Mine is novel testable predictions or go home. So even though some philosophers may count that as evidence, some minuscule amount of evidence, I definitely don't, and science definitely doesn't.
So a lot of the evidence for evolutionary theory was such that we had already known it. It's just Darwin came along, provided us a theoretical framework for understanding that evidence, and it thereby gained evidential justification for that. So for instance, we had already known about fossils. We had already known about Archaeopteryx. We had already known about transitional forms. We had already known about biogeographical distribution of, like the part of South Africa, or the part of South America where it's facing Africa, and then the part of Africa facing South Africa. Like they have really interesting fossil connections that are like spookily there, right? So we had already known all that before Darwin came along, before continental shift and so on. But then once we found out that, once we came up with this theory of continental shift, it made so much sense of our evidence that we had already gathered on biogeographical distribution, on the transitional forms, and so on. It thereby gains evidential confirmation by means of that, although it's not a novel testable prediction. It's something that we already knew, but it's a new framework that allows us to explain those. This is standard science. Like I'm not using some kind of philosophical thing. Like this is what scientists
Nope. Again, so that's completely false. So again, scientists, that's basis for a hypothesis. So again, evidence can mean different things here. That's evidence as a basis to come to a hypothesis. It is not confirmation of the hypothesis. For that, you need novel testable predictions, which Darwin made, specifically about his birds, and that you can predict the relationship between the hardness of the nuts and the beaks. And he made those predictions and tested them and found like, oh, this is good evidence. I predicted this before I knew it. So there were novel testable predictions made.
Actually, he made the observations of the beaks first, so we had already known about the beaks and so on. Later on, he was consolidating.
No, he made many predictions in there, lots of them that we didn't know beforehand. So that's a different topic.
I'm talking about his voyage on the Beagle, right? So when he was doing his voyage on the Beagle, he hadn't come up with his evolutionary theory yet, but he was still collecting the data about the beaks and so on. And
then he came up with a hypothesis and then tested the hypothesis.
It did not make the novel
prediction. So again, no.
And they explained his observations that he made on the Galapagos. They explained how they went back and
you're repeating yourself. So again, my answer is always going to be the same here. Never. That's a good basis for a hypothesis. Never confirmatory evidence. Does not ever count.
Okay. I think we should move on. I think we should move. Let's find a different topic, because I don't think we're going to go anywhere with this.
Well, no. You just asked, how does my epistemology differentiate? This is how it does, and it works 100%. So just use the novel testable predictions as the basis to differentiate. It works. I don't count the fact that you can post-dict things as evidence because it's called a post-hoc rationalization. We literally know that does not work. It's literally a fallacy in science to do this. It's called post-hoc theorization, you can just Google the term, that doesn't count. It counts as a basis for a hypothesis, which is called abduction, or affirming the consequent. It does not count as confirmatory evidence. You need predictions, which is, again, why no one in science accepts any of the quantum mechanics theories. They don't make predictions. You need the predictions. It's one of the biggest debates in physics right now, because none of them can make predictions, so none of them are accepted. It's only the predictions that matter. No one cares about the postdiction.
No, I mean, I'm not saying I don't think that prediction matters. I'm saying that accounting for previous data that other paradigms weren't able to account for. I mean, it's just clear that scientists accept that as evidence.
No, I just proved that wrong. I just proved that false.
No, you didn't.
In physics, they never accept the fact that you can explain post stuff. No one cares. No one cares. That's literally the topic in physics that most physicists are debating. Should we still require testable predictions? They're like, yes, that's the consensus, is only testable predictions, or we don't care. I never
said we don't require testable predictions. I said we can also have, in addition to testable predictions, even if those are a necessary but insufficient condition, we can also have the accounting for evidence that we had already known exists, but that other theories and other hypotheses aren't able to account for. That happened with Darwin. He went when he was.
Well, sure, yeah. I'm not saying that isn't an additional thing, but again, my necessary condition here is the testable predictions. If you want to add other stuff too, that's fine.
I haven't denied that, right? I have not denied that predictions are not evidentially valuable. I think that predictions that are novel predictions are immensely evidentially valuable.
The necessary condition thing here is the important part. For me, it's a necessary condition. Doesn't matter what else you add. I don't care how much else you add. It means nothing until you meet that necessary condition.
So I'm not sure whether or not it's a necessary condition. Our original contention was whether or not these kind of accounting for past data, whether or not that can be evidentially conferring, whether or not it can raise the probability of hypothesis.
Okay, yeah. So I mentioned that before. Philosophers have a different qualification of what counts as evidence here than scientists in this case. So the fact that you have an idea could be evidence of the idea. The fact that it's not logically contradictory could be evidence of the idea as opposed to a logical contradiction. The fact that something could explain something, like magical leprechauns could explain the cup falling over, is evidence of magical leprechauns, given the garbage philosophical definition of evidence. I'm not using that definition. I'm using the scientific definition. So yes, I understand that in philosophy you can count those as evidence of marginal qualifications of just insignificant amounts. Yes, you can definitely count certain things as evidence by that definition. I'm not using that definition here. I'm using the necessary condition as the minimum basis of my definition of, for it to count as evidence, it has to meet that necessary condition, or it doesn't even count as what I call evidence.
Okay, so so we have this. No, I'm just thinking about where we should take this next, because I think we've reached an impasse. I'm wondering if we can go back to the mindedness.
Well, I don't think this was an impasse, because again, you were just asking about how does my epistemology differentiate between these two things. So that was kind of the point here, is that my epistemology can accurately differentiate between these two things, but I wasn't trying to get you to accept that. That wasn't a requirement for the point that we were trying to make. It was just you were asking, how do I differentiate between the evil demon and the squirrel? And I said, here's my methodology of how I do it.
Okay, you said testable predictions. Okay.
Yeah.
So how can you still see where I'm coming from? Like, how is it not an equally testable prediction when you just make all the claims that you would see the same thing about the squirrel and the droppings and so on, but with you add the proviso that you're just hallucinating them? It's still the predictions. It's still the predictions. It's still testable predictions, and you're making them in advance. But you just add the proviso that all the data is hallucinatory data, but you're still predicting that you're going to be hallucinating the squirrel. You're still predicting that you're going to be hallucinating the droppings and so on. And if your criterion is being able to distinguish imagination from reality, then even with this addition of novel testable predictions, you still can't distinguish between you're completely hallucinating the novel testable predictions and you're not hallucinating the novel testable predictions, in which case your criterion of testable predictions has not actually been able to avoid the radical skeptical scenario, because we still have these two identical scenarios, which are they both make the testable predictions and they both have those testable predictions confirmed, but yet you still can't differentiate between them as to whether or not you're in this one or whether or not you're in this one. They have testable predictions, but one of them is still imaginative. One of them is still in reality. It's out there, in which case you have not succeeded in differentiating between imagination and reality. So I'm wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, so if my criterion was you need to differentiate between imagination and reality in all possible logical cases, then yeah, that would be true, but I don't need to. All I need to do is with a reasonable amount of reliability. So the fact that it doesn't occur that two people make mutually exclusive hypotheses that make the same prediction, and usually it's one person makes a hypothesis with one kind of prediction and they get it right, means I've confirmed this hypothesis. This is not imaginary. It doesn't matter what the other ones can do. So the fact that Einstein predicted the curvature of the light around the sun to be different and no one else did, and he got it right, well, that shows that's the real one and not the imaginary one given my hypothesis. The only case in which you would be right that mine can't is when two different hypotheses both make the same predictions and both get it right, which doesn't happen. I don't know of any. I know of two cases where that's happened, and none of them. And so it's only in those two cases of all humanity that mine can't differentiate between imagination and reality. And both cases, later predictions confirmed one or the other that the other one didn't make. So in every single case in all of humans' knowledge, my method has successfully predicted the difference between imagination and reality. If we assess them as two different hypotheses, we just look at the human history and what we accept is true, and we think, and we apply my methodology to all of human history, it's got it right every single time. Every single time. So the fact that it can't in certain cases doesn't matter because it got it right in every other case. It doesn't need to differentiate in all possible logical cases.
Yeah, okay. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to give a criterion for knowledge, right? We were talking about that earlier. We were saying, yes, how do we determine whether or not we know something or have a reason to believe it? You gave this criterion, right? You gave this criterion. We have to be able to differentiate it from merely being an imagined thing from being an experimental kind of truth, objective sort of thing, right? That is your criterion of knowing it. But now we have these two scenarios. We have let's take the two scenarios. We have one of them, all of our sense experiences are veridical, and the other one, all of our sense experiences are hallucinatory. All the same predictions, everything is the same, right? Given your criterion, we cannot distinguish, we cannot differentiate. Given our evidence, given our phenomenological data, given our evidence, we cannot differentiate between which one is merely idea or which one is reality. We cannot differentiate between the two. In which case, given your criteria of knowledge, we don't know which one is true. We don't know whether or not we are in this kind of hallucinatory realm or whether or not we are in objective reality.
Right. So
your criterion of knowledge, right?
So if every single piece of knowledge ever gained through all humanity had that exact criterion of two different hypotheses, both made before the event and both confirmed at the exact same time, then it would be impossible for us to have knowledge. That's never happened. So every single case it has not happened has given us knowledge.
Yes, but I just gave you the two hypotheses.
No. So you have to make both before the events, and it has to be confirmed after the prediction. That has not happened.
And before the event, you just made a hypothesis about all the events in the history. So now you just contradicted. You claimed that you just claimed that you have to have the hypothesis making the prediction before the event.
Yes.
But now you're trying to use evidence from all the past history, all the things that we already knew, that all our beliefs in the past were false. Those are contradictory. You just said,
what do you mean?
You just said that we need these kind of novel predictions from your hypothesis, and you can't base it on things we already knew. But now you come along with your hypothesis and you said, well, now look, I can explain all these cases in human history in the past that we already knew we were faulty on. I can explain those with my theory. You've just contradicted yourself with your very...
I have no idea what you're talking about. So I'm using a basis of our past knowledge confirmed by other methodologies that didn't exist, or that existed before mine, and saying, here's the stuff we can reasonably confer as reliable in past data. And then I'm taking my model and building a hypothesis off of that and saying, well, how does this work? So this isn't...
You said you're developing your hypothesis off of that, right? You're using those.
Yes.
You're using those previous ones. And so
yes, that's how all hypotheses are made.
You just try to use that as evidence for why your criterion is right. But now you just said that those are evidentially conferring for your hypothesis. But those are things that we already knew. Those aren't novel predictions of your hypothesis.
Yes, that's why we need to make new novel testable predictions after that. So what you do is to come up with a hypothesis. Wait. Stop. So what you do is when you look at past data, come up with a hypothesis to explain the past data, and then apply it to new data. You've been predictions after that. So I'm saying the commonality in all of these things in our past that seems to get them all right is this novel testable predictions thing. This seems to be a pretty good method. Let's apply it to the new stuff, and then we test new discoveries like the new things in physics. Novel testable predictions confirm those. This is a good system. This works really, really well. So I come up with the hypothesis and looking at past data, like all hypotheses do, which is post-hoc theorization correct. That is not a confirmation of the hypothesis, just post-hoc theorization. And then we apply it to new data. And if we get the same positive result from the new data, that's confirmatory evidence, which we have gotten from my methodology. It does work better than other methodologies.
Okay, well, see, what I was getting hung up on is when I asked you why we should accept your criterion here, like why, as in a reason for giving it, you cited that it's always worked in the past. You said when we were looking at the past,
induction is a great evidence or basis of knowledge.
But now you just said we need testable. You said we need new testable predictions in the future for having reason to believe something, for being evidence. But now you just said, when I asked you for evidence or for reasons for your hypothesis, you cited the past things that we already knew. Those aren't novel predictions.
Okay, so let me clarify. Evidence, when you talk about a phenomenon you're explaining, would not be novel evidence. Novel evidence would be only the new testable prediction. So I use the past phenomenon that we see to come up with a hypothesis. That's not evidence. That's not evidence. Wait, I'm clarifying. So I'm clarifying now. So that isn't the evidence. The evidence is it's been confirmed to work better than other hypotheses after the theory was made. So we use the hypothesis that, well, if we're looking at the past data, what works, novel testable predictions seem to work. That's my hypothesis, which is not confirmed yet. If that hypothesis works, it'll work better than other hypotheses in the future. We have observed that. That was a novel testable prediction that we got right. That would be the evidence of why we accept this one over the other ones. That's what you mean by evidence.
Okay. Thank you for the clarification. That helps. I think that helps. So I'm just trying to take stock of where we should go next, because that clarification helped. So
just going back, the original point we were on was there's a difference between the evil demon and the squirrel. How does my methodology differentiate between the two? This is how it does it. If you want to continue your point from there.
And your methodology was that the one of them makes novel testable predictions and the other doesn't. Is that your experience?
A person makes novel tests. So I have a hypothesis I made up. There's a square circle in my pocket. There is a square circle in my pocket. Here is some scientific thing we don't know yet. It doesn't matter what the hypothesis is. If you use it to make predictions, that's the key. It's not necessarily that the theory itself entails predictions. It's that you can use this, whatever your idea is, to gain some insight into the world that you didn't know before, and it's right. That would be the prediction.
See, but what I can use, I hope you're seeing where I'm getting hung up with, because I can use both of the hallucinatory hypothesis and the vertical hypothesis. I can use both of those to make the same predictions.
Yes, you could.
So I can't tell between them. So I don't know whether or not there's an external.
In the one case where you make two different hypotheses that both make the same prediction, my method would not tell you which is true. That is correct. That doesn't happen. So in the case where this is not the case, where there's one theory that makes a prediction, it does tell you the difference. So this is only a problem in the case that there are two hypotheses that are different that make the same prediction, which isn't a thing. So yes, if that was a common occurrence in human history, then my method would not be very good to gain knowledge. Because it's not a common occurrence in human history, it's a very reliable way to gain knowledge.
So I'm wondering about this sort of common occurrence, right? Because, and you're saying it doesn't happen. Like, the thing is, we're talking about whether or not we have knowledge, right? We're talking about that, whether or not we have knowledge. And so the question is, given your criterion of knowledge, do we have knowledge of the external world? Can we differentiate it? Can we differentiate the real world from the kind of imagined scenario? Now, we have these two hypotheses, right? And we can all make predictions on the basis of those. Given your criterion, the only way we could know that there's an external world is that if we can differentiate between them.
Yeah, the differentiation is which one came first. So if that one came first, we've now differentiated them.
Okay, so I'm just wondering where to take this, because which one came first?
Well, I'm not sure how this was relating to your original point, because the way we got into this was we were comparing the different hypotheses of theism versus naturalism, and you brought up I forget which arguments we were going down, the teleological ones about how God could have some particular property and that would make this particular universe likely. And I said, well, a particle could have some particular property and this could have this universe. And then we went to, well, how do we differentiate if values and perfections are actually real things versus imaginary things? And you asked me, well, how do I do that? Well, I do it novel testable predictions, and that's how I do it. And then I think your next move would be to present one of yours or something, or see if you have a better way of doing it or something.
Well, so I just want to, I still want to see if we can push this criterion of knowledge, though, because I'm not quite seeing how, maybe you can spell this out further. I'm not quite seeing why one of them being first matters. So if I was brought up, right?
Well, that's the thing you said earlier. Remember you said prediction is better than postdiction.
Well, no, first just means which one we came up with first. Both of them could make predictions. We could just come up with one of them 1 second before the other one, and they both make predictions about something 10 years in the future, say. So it doesn't matter.
Yeah, if that happens, then it's a problem. If it doesn't happen, it's not a problem. So again, it's the prediction, the fact that you came up with the prediction before it occurred, means that one is the evidence, whatever you came up with. I don't care if it's a square circle. I don't care if it's a God, an all-powerful God being who burns people at the stake or whatever. It doesn't make a difference. Whatever one you came up with first, because it was first, that is evidence. And the fact after we discover it, you can come up with lots of different hypotheses, doesn't mean a thing. It's the fact it was first.
Yeah, but I mean, so what we're talking about is whether or not we can know something in principle. Not like whether or not it's common or does in fact happen. We're talking about whether we can know something in principle. In principle, whether or not we can know something. Your criterion was whether or not we can differentiate imagination from reality. But in principle, we cannot differentiate the hallucinatory hypothesis from the veridicality hypothesis. I don't see how being temporally first matters here. Both of them make predictions. We're talking about in principle, not which one actually happens to contingently come out first. We're talking about which can you, in principle, know whether or not there is an external world. Given your criterion, we would have to, in principle, in order to be able to know, we'd have to be able to differentiate between the imagined scenario and the reality scenario. But we cannot differentiate between the hallucinatory hypothesis and the non-hallucinatory hypothesis, the veridicality hypothesis. Both of them, it's the same sense data, it's the same things that are impacting our senses, and so on. So that's really where I'm going at. I'm not trying to talk about which one actually happens to come first. We're talking about whether or not we can, in principle, know things.
Well, I think you're confusing. Can we, in principle, differentiate between the ontology of the thing, and can we, in principle, differentiate the methodology that we use to come to the conclusion? I think yes, we can differentiate between the methodology we used, and if we have a reliable methodology, that justifies the conclusion of one ontology over the other, even though we can't ontologically separate the two. So if we have a different methodology, one that is more reliable than another, then it's reasonable to confer or to conclude in its ontological conclusion, even though we have no way to actually ontologically differentiate between the two.
Okay. So that's some clarification on the ontology of things versus the methodology of things. I did want to say I have 15 minutes left because I got a class at 1:30 and it's 1:05 for here.
Yeah.
So I got 15 minutes left before I have to leave. But yeah, with that knowledge, did you want to have like any questions or go any further? Or
this is perfect. Like, I love your questions are great. This is exactly the kind of conversation I'm with. So just keep going if that was it.
Okay. No, I just wanted to let you know that I only had about 15 minutes left. I'm wondering where we should take this. So
we can go back to the original line of questioning because we brought up two hypotheses. One is a God who will design an orderly universe. One is a particle that will design an orderly universe. They're both necessary because of these values and perfections. How do we differentiate the values and perfections are real? I use novel testable predictions based on that methodology. Values and perfections are purely imaginary. What you would say, you'd probably use a different methodology to conclude that these are not imaginary or something.
Yeah, so my methodology would probably be something like, I'm not entirely sure whether or not I'm an externalist or an internalist yet, so I don't study epistemology, unfortunately. Study as in, I don't do scholarly research in it. Like, I've taken epistemology classes and so on. But, as I said, like, my scholarly research is mostly in, like, metaphysics, philosophy of religion. So I'm still undecided as to whether or not I want to be an internalist or an externalist. An externalist roughly says that factors that are outside of the knowing subject can confer justification on his or her beliefs. Maybe, for instance, that our cognitive faculties are working reliably, or maybe we have a relevant causal connection to the fact known. Or internalists, by contrast, say, this is just for the audience. I'm not trying to like educate you.
Yeah, I'm familiar.
Yeah, I'm just trying to help the audience. Internalists, by contrast, say that only factors of which the subject is aware and that are internal to their conscious experience can confer justification on their beliefs. So, for instance, if they're aware of certain reasons that support their beliefs, and so on. So I'm not quite sure which one I favor with respect to my methodology. If I were an externalist, I'd probably go the route of like maybe reliabilism or something. And so we wouldn't really have to be consciously aware of the methodology that we're using. So long as it is in fact reliable, we would be able to have knowledge on the basis of that. I actually do probably maybe lean towards phenomenal conservatism, which is kind of like an internalist. It's kind of like a mitigated internalist view, which just says that if if you have a rational seeming that something is the case, if it seems to you that something is the case, and you don't have countervailing reasons to doubt the deliverances of that seeming, then you have prima facie justification for that. So that would probably be my...
I would love to ask a question about that. So just when that ideology alone, I think that all of those have a defeater. The fact that we have lots of imaginary things and they seem like true, but they're clearly false. People believe in voodoo. People believe in all kinds of gods. Why would that not qualify as a defeater for all initial beliefs right off the bat?
Yeah, well, because it's kind of like a particularist approach, right? So you take a particular belief, you say, okay, well, this thing seems to be the case. Do I have defeaters? Do I have reasons to think that it's false? And in the case of like voodoo, we could gain those defeaters, and so we would have a defeater. We know that voodoo is just BS and it's based on misunderstandings of the universe and so on.
Well, we'll just go more into detail about that, because I think that any belief you have, like I believe this object is solid, we have defeaters for that, because we know scientifically it's 99% empty space. If I pick up a metal object and a plastic object, the metal object's going to feel colder. Like, it's an incredibly obvious feeling to me, but we know that's false because it's about the transition of heat through different objects.
Yeah, so, it leaves your hand faster than the other one.
Yep, and same thing with objects that I see. I know that this screen I'm looking at is an optical illusion. There is no like pierce in there. It's a bunch of red, green, and blue dots. So everything I experience, I know it's wrong. Like I can see pareidolia in different trees. There's all kinds of different fallacies, biases, illusions, hallucinations that are all over the human mind. Shouldn't all of those immediately count as a defeater for pretty much every belief? Like, what would not be able to be defeated by the knowledge of the tens of thousands of fallacies, biases, illusions, and hallucinations we know that the human mind has? What would not be defeated by those?
Yeah, so, well, I think it's... Okay, so I'll make like two responses to that. So one of them is just like phenomenal conservatism just says so long as there aren't defeaters, then you do have the justification. So if we point out scenarios where we do have a lot of defeaters, then phenomenal conservatism will actually say that, yeah, you don't have knowledge or you don't have justification.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'm not objecting to philosophical conservatism.
So then the second thing that I would say in response to that is that I think that there are some plausible cases where we don't have defeaters for our seemings. So for instance,
cognito.
Yeah, I was just about to say, like, it seems to me that I exist. But also, I mean, it seems to me that torturing babies for fun is morally impermissible. I have that seeming, and I don't think that there are sufficient reasons to get me to doubt that seeming, to doubt the deliverances of that seeming. I think that the arguments for moral error theory and moral anti-realism, I don't think that they succeed. And so I don't think that I have sufficient defeaters for that particular belief. And we could probably go on like...
math and logic, definitely.
Math and logic, yeah. The cogito. I also think certain portions of morality, like the really clear and distinct ones, to use...
well, I'm happy to grant morality in some cases, but we should go specifically like perfections. Like those, I think, no. Those, I think, are pretty silly.
See, I'm not sure about that one. Like, I think that, like, being vicious, for instance, like maybe being like super greedy, being hateful towards another, I think I could just see, like, I don't have a defeater for that. I think I could just see that that's a bad making property, and hence being virtuous would be a good making property. The opposite of being vicious.
Oh, sure. I'm happy to grant that, but we can say that morality is an emergent property of more fundamental things. So, for example, being vicious is having a certain kind of a gluon, and that's a result of, or like a sun. A sun is an emergent property of helium and hydrogen coming together and having an effect on a gravity. The same thing could happen to morality. Morality could be an emergent property of other fundamental things. So, assuming that those perfections are entailed in the ontology of the fundamental being doesn't follow just because that they exist. So saying they exist is like the sun exists. That doesn't mean the origin of the universe has a sun in it.
Yeah. So I totally, I think I agree with what you were saying there. I don't think I have disagreements with that. And this does go back to the fact that, like I've been trying to steelman theism here, but as we said at the beginning, like I'm not a theist. And so I actually don't think that this stage 2 ultimately succeeds. I think it might be suggestive at times, but I do also worry about getting certain perfections of a divine being merely from the fact that we have a necessary foundation. So, I just ultimately maybe we can end on that portion of resonance where I also have difficulties in this stage 2. Like I remember for the audience at the beginning, I distinguished between the stage 1 and the stage 2, where stage 1 gets you to this necessary foundation, but stage 2 tries to identify that with God. But ever since I came across the contingency arguments, I've been looking at arguments for stage 2 to try to bridge that gap, and ultimately I'm not convinced. But I do think that someone there's reasonable disagreement here, and I think someone like Josh Rasmussen and Rob Coons and other people, like they might see things that I don't, or they might have evidence that I don't. But after considering the stage 2 arguments, ultimately I'm probably in agreement with you that I'm not sure that they succeed. So
yeah, I totally agree. I think the contingency arguments are the best logical argument for that the Christians use. I totally agree. There has to be some kind of necessary foundation, though I would include an infinite regress as a kind of necessary foundation in mine, but that's a different thing. So yeah, I totally agree with you that the contingency argument is a pretty good argument, but as we try to give definitions, it completely loses its foundation from there. And yeah, I've actually had Josh Rasmussen on twice. I got Robert Coons coming on later this month, so we'll definitely explore some of that. I'm just going to talk with.
I've had Josh on my channel and Rob on my channel. I love both of them. It's so great. Oh my god.
Definitely. Well, anyway, it was great talking to you. Fantastic conversation. Thanks for coming on, and I'll let you get to your class. Have fun.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Talk to you.